Okay. Can you hear me, Peter?
Yeah, Matt, how you going, right?
Excellent. Look, we are live. I'll just get ready and we'll get straight into it. Sure. I'd like to welcome everyone to Northern Vibe. Thank you very much for joining us live this afternoon. My name is Matt Maloney. I'm a North Queenslander by birth and a far North Queenslander by choice. I'm passionate about creating a new state for North Queensland. I want to get a voice, empowerment, autonomy and control for us all. I'm also curious about people, places and the magnificent area that we're living in. For newer viewers unfamiliar with the new state, what it means and entails, there are a number of great websites to get on. There's ours, Boot Brisbane, which I do encourage you to get on. There's the North Queensland State Alliance, Inc. website, which is also very, very good. It explains what the concept is and how we can go about it. We also have a number of other interviews with some really interesting people. One I have to say I'm particularly proud of is with Bernard Salt, and in the future we're going to have some more magnificent interviews with people who are almost as interesting and as well qualified as the gentleman I'm just about to interview tonight. So look, I really encourage people to get informed about this really interesting and informative issue and jump on the page. Look, my guest tonight is Peter Raffles. Peter was delivering a lecture right before he came to us tonight. He's really time short. Peter, thank you very much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to come and speak to us tonight. That's not going unnoticed or unappreciated. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Peter. Peter's a really highly qualified person. He's a really interesting chap to have a beer with too. So if you ever get the opportunity, and I have had that opportunity to have a beer with him, take it, ladies and gentlemen. It's well worth your time. He's currently principal of Conflict Solutions Proprietary Limited. He's an accredited mediator. He's worked on commercial disputes. He's worked on remote Indigenous community disputes. He's worked on industrial disputes, including Qantas, environmental disputes, organisational change disputes. He's mediated in Australia and the Pacific, including Papua New Guinea, where he's facilitated the creation of wealth and the keeping of peace. No small achievements in themselves. He's also a lawyer. He's a current member of the bar, specialising in administrative law, governance, employment and industrial relations. He has a real interest in constitutional issues, and this is demonstrated by his publications. He's also published. 2 out of the 4 of his publications are related to the new state. In 2017, the JC Law Review published The Formation of a New North Queensland State, Constitutional Issues and the Procedural Pathway. That paper is available on both websites, both ours and Peter's. I do recommend it. It's actually a really good read. I have read it myself. In 2018, the same journal published North Queensland, a New State, How the Voice of the Collective Can Be Heard. Again, I've read that paper myself and it's well worth it. It doesn't end there, ladies and gentlemen. He holds a commercial pilot's license. Like myself, he's a bit of a cricket tragic, but unlike me, he's actually good at the game and coaches. Sounds all highfalutin and academic, but ladies and gentlemen, I know I sound like Tim from Dental, but that's not all. He started work as a marine mechanic and was Apprentice of the Year 2 years running. There really isn't much this chap can't do, ladies and gentlemen. He can fly you into a conflict zone. He can mediate the conflict. He can write a paper about it afterwards. Then go for a quick 50 overs, and if your boat needs fixing before you go fishing, he can sort that out as well. Peter, I bet you've got some great stories from the mechanics workshop. Before we get too deep, can you tell me some great great stories from the workshop?
Well, thank you for a very flattering introduction, Matt, tonight. Yes, it's been an interesting journey, that's for sure. And I grew up in a small country town, South Johnson. Cairns and Innisfail are both suburbs of South Johnson, as I like to say. But yeah, I did my trade in Innisfail before moving to Townsville, and spent a number of years working for the Australian Institute of Marine Science as a mechanic, and went back to night school, did a senior. But yeah, lots of interesting boat stories there, from the Heron Island in the south to the Torres Strait in the north. But yeah, and being now a lawyer and reflecting back on it all, and being one of the first 10 graduates of law from James Cook University was a real privilege. And coming from Innisfail, yeah, there's a bit in there around Innisfail that resonates with me about the North Queensland state. I mean, if you think about, the Mackay area, which was such a key area in the turn of the century in the new state, and in Innisfail and Ingham and the Herbert and the Mulgrave and the Burdick, and they're all pretty. And there was a lot of people, you know, in history that passed away in the sugar industry from disease, you know, Wheals disease. And what's interesting about that is that the remedy or the diagnosis of that disease didn't happen in a university laboratory or a laboratory in Brisbane or anywhere else. It was discovered by Dr. Cotter. And Dr. Cotter was in Innisfail, and he actually identified it in a laboratory in the back of his surgery. And so it was North Queensland who actually identified the disease. And I guess as we look forward in the coming south of diseases with climate change, and you go, well, we need to have, you know, the facilities here. That's sort of right from the start of my time. But being a mechanic, I want a bit of an anecdote for you, if I can, Matt, about, you know, where my journey started in Innisfail and what I learned at university, and then at a commission of inquiry. And it sort of takes me back to the story, a bit of an anecdote, if you like. And the fellow, after being introduced, he says, yeah, you're a mechanic. I said, yeah. He said, you might be able to help me out with my vehicle. And I said, oh, yeah. He said, yeah, it's my life vehicles. He's not running real good. And I said, oh yeah, tell me about it. He said, yeah, I think it's just a spark plug. You know, it just misses and misfires. And I said, oh yeah, tell me some more. He tells me a bit more. And I said, so did your vehicle surge? You know, like it go forward really quickly and then drop back again? And he says, I think you've driven me car. You know, I think you've driven me vehicle. And I sort of looked at him and I said, you know, and sometimes as it goes along, does it pull, you know, really extreme to the left and then off to the right? Oh, you've definitely driven me car. I said, and your family in it? He says, oh, it's rough as. It's just rough as, mate. And I listened to him through all this, and I was thinking, I said, look, mate, I don't think it's just a spark plug, you know. I said, I'm looking at your car, you know, and, you know, like it surges a bit like the economy and, you know, swings to the left and right. Look, I think your vehicle, your car was built in 1901, you know, when the Constitution was written. I don't think there's a spark plug policy that's going to fix your car. You know, go down to the ALP workshop, they might give you a policy for the next couple of years, or over the ALP policy shed, they might give you a new spark plug. But I think your car's up for a bit of an upgrade, I think. And I think that's where we are as a community. You know, I think we keep going through these cycles in a state, but ultimately, you know, I think there's some need for structural reform.
Look, I love that story. It's a dead set doozy, and so accurate, really. You know, the pulls to the left, the pulls to the right, and the fact that we need structural change. Look, I think both you and I are committed to the same fundamental structural change too, because I do notice there has been a little bit in the media recently about the idea of structural change being the abolition of the states and empowering Canberra and also recognising local government in the Constitution. I am not in favour of that idea at all, for a number of reasons. Of course, first, constitutionally, it's kind of impossible. The Federation exists because the states say it so. It's not the other way around. But I know that you've got a fair bit of knowledge in this. You worked in I think it was the Electoral and Administrative Review Commission. Isn't that the case?
Yeah. When I finished in 1991, I finished my law degree at James Cook University. I was offered there was a job came up at EARC, as it was known, the Electoral and Administrative Review Commission, and to work as a lawyer. And I was a young lawyer then, of course, learning the ropes. And I was there for 3 years and ended up one of their authors, one of their 2 or 3 of their reports. So how did EARC come about? EARC was a child. There were 2 children that came into existence after the Fitzgerald inquiry. And the story from Fitzgerald, if I can go back a little bit further before that, and say, you know, the Fitzgerald inquiry came about because of, you know, corruption that was in the Queensland government system, and ultimately the Commission of Inquiry found a whole bunch of problems within the system. But let's go a little bit further back than that. And so Queensland became a separate colony in 59, I think it was. And then it right through the whole negotiation for federation. And it had two houses, an upper house and a lower house in the Queensland Parliament, a Legislative Assembly and a Legislative Council, which was the upper house. An interesting bit about Queensland was the upper house was fully appointed like the House of Lords. And so every member in the upper house had been appointed by the government and not elected. And it was caused a lot of difficulties, including the abolition of the death penalty. So after federation, the Labor Party had sworn, that it would get rid of the upper house, and one of the drivers was the abolition of the death penalty. And so in 1921, I'm going to share a figure with you here. In 1921, President Ted Theodore had made a number of appointments to the upper house, so that Labor controlled the upper house and appointed the governor. And then there was a referendum held. Can I share a screen with you, Matt? Yeah, I can go back to just talking through it. There's somewhere on there you'll be able to enable my screen sharing, but that's okay. I was talking about the history and coming up in Queensland, and the Theodore government had gained control of both houses in 1921, and then you're sharing your own screen. It's yeah, well, that's okay. So a referendum had been held on the 5th of May 1917 to abolish the upper house in Queensland. And that vote, 119,000 people said yes, they wanted it abolished, and 179,000 people had said no, we don't want it abolished. But despite that, Theodore nevertheless had the vote in both houses and abolished both houses. And so from 1922 onwards, we had a Labor government through to the 1930s in one term, then right through to 1957. And then the government changed to the Conservative side, and it was right through to 1989. And of course, that was the time when the Fitzgerald inquiry came about. And it said, well, you don't have checks and balances without an upper house. And so that was really the beginning, or the genesis, if you like, for want of a better term, of the problems in Queensland and what led to EARC. And once I went to EARC, we reviewed the Constitution, human rights, judicial review, protection of whistleblowers, protection of archives legislation, all of those things which are key points in a system of government. What I learned at EARC was just how broken the Queensland system was with no upper house. I recall one afternoon, and I guess this is one of the moments, there were two moments for my time at EARC that I will recall on North Queensland. One, we were sitting one afternoon talking about reforms to administrative law with the law team, and they were saying, oh, we can roll this out, we can do this. And I sat at the other end of the table and said, can you tell me how we're going to do that in Guthallungra, Gumloo, Almaden? And there was this silence around the room, and the guy looks at me from the other end of the table and says, where's Almaden? I said, it's just outside Mareeba, and Mareeba's just outside of Nambour, just north of Nambour there. What it said to me was just how little people understood about how big the state is, and how we live differently, in the words of my good friend Henry Frackier, is how differently we live. Now, the second point at the commission is I'd met Wayne Goss, and he held a speech down at the Queensland Club one night, and he was complaining about centralism from the federal government. And I was in the room. I'd flown him around when I was piloting. I'd flown him around Western Queensland, and he saw me and had a bit of a smile. And I said, Wayne, it seems to me that as you're complaining about Canberra from Brisbane, we in the north have the same complaints from the north to the south. And a small acknowledgement, but that was the beginning really of my journey, because I got to understand just how broken the Queensland system is in terms of accountability. And in the words of Tony Fitzgerald in 2015, no upper house, no Bill of Rights, the government can do whatever it wants. And so far as us living in the north, that's a real problem.
I couldn't agree with you more. And really, there are so many systematic problems. Now, I really enjoy speaking to a lot of our Indigenous guests. Like I've had Yodi Batsky on here, and I'm lining up some other people as well. But as a state and as a nation, understandably, we kind of focus on what's happening with Indigenous people, and I get why. Like, of course, we're all one people. We're a demos. We all need to move together.
Yeah, we've lost the link, I think.
We're going live.
We're back live, recording,
No, indeed.
live on Facebook. Yeah. Well, here we are back again. You know, after a bit of an interruption. What do we do as North Queenslanders? You know, you say, oh, bit of a glitch in the system. Well, you know, when Cyclone Yasi came through, you know, oh, Annably saved the North from, you know, Cyclone Yasi. A lot of rubbish. You know, we've been looking after each other for years, and how do we do it? We adapt, we adjust, we accommodate. You know, we're creative, and we move on. And so, yeah, great, we're back. Let's do it. Let's keep going.
Look,
that's what makes us North Queenslanders. Sure.
Exactly. Look, just by way of explanation to the people who tuned in live, my profuse, profound, and unqualified apologies. My internet dropped out midway through that. So look, we'll pick up precisely where we left off. Actually, do you think a new state might fix the my internet creations, Peter? No, I'm just.
Well, maybe if it was an internet problem, maybe our allocation from the federal government it might be a bit bigger. If we had a Jackie Lambie sitting in the Senate, 12 senators in Tasmania, Jackie Lambie with the balance of power. If we had that in the North, maybe our infrastructure would be a bit better.
Okay, well, actually, that leads into one of my questions. Senate representation and what a new state will mean for the Federation and the Constitution. Let's talk.
Yeah, let's go back. Can I go back in history a bit? And
yes.
Say, you know, maybe where did we come from and to? There's something that, you know, in my research and the publications that, you know, we became very passionate about this topic. And so I said, the question came up a couple of times, you know, oh, look, if we're going to become a new state, it's got to be a referendum, you know, the whole country. I went, oh, gee, that's a bit challenging. No, it's just got to be a referendum of Queensland. No, it's just got to be the people of North Queensland. Well, which one is it? And that really took me on the journey to say, well, I'm going to go and answer this question, you know, 124, section 124, 121 of the Constitution, research that. But in my journey, this is something I discovered, and it's so relevant today. So in 1898, it was the first vote for federation in 1898. Queensland did not send any representatives to the constitutional conventions after 1895. And the reason for that was because North Queensland and Central Queensland wanted to be separate. And so when the first vote for federation was taken in 1898, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, Western Australia, and South Australia were going to form the country and come back and get Queensland later. Queensland did not vote in the first referendum for federation in 1898. But that vote failed. And so something called the Secret Premiers Conference was convened. And it was like, well, how do we get Queensland on board? One of the ways that was done, it was Section 7, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution, and it's still there today, is that Queensland can be divided into divisions for electing senators. And the deal was, North Queenslanders, you'll get your own senators. But Section 7, Paragraph 2 says, until the Commonwealth otherwise provides, Queensland may be divided. So until the Commonwealth otherwise provides. Well, it didn't provide right through to 1983. And in 1983, the Hawke government passed legislation, Section 39 of the Electoral Act, that says Queensland may not be divided for the purposes of electing senators. The get square for the dismissal in 1975. That simple. What that meant for North Queenslanders is, well, today, in the last parliament, we had 2 senators north of the Tropic of Capricorn. Today, we got 2.5, I think. I mean, it's a bit hard to know. We're the third one, that sometime in Townsville and sometimes in Brisbane. And so it's a bit hard to know. But ultimately, both of the senators belong to the political parties. And yet the Senate is the state's house and supposed to be standing there. If we, like Tasmania, we got 1 million people north of Rockhampton, Tasmania has 450,000. They got 12 senators. We got 2. If we had 12 senators, our own senators, You know, in the words of Cold Dwyer, our fair share, would we get it? Well, it's actually bigger than that. Would we actually be part of the federation? What federation is about, what federalism is about growth. And if we had our senators, yes, we would grow. No question. How do we do that? Well, to get the referendum, of course, we've got to have the balance of power in the state parliament, and we've got an election coming up, and that's probably a time for a lot of people to think, well, where do we go with here?
It's almost like you're channeling me. There are some really interesting points that, if we have the time, I'd like to come back to. But let's keep the flow of this interview going, considering that it was rudely interrupted by my lack of internet. The election.
Yeah.
What's going to happen, in your considered professional opinion?
As I said, at the moment, there's 93 seats in the House. There's a majority, I think it's a majority of 2 or 3. And to get what we say from the North Queensland State Alliance's point of view in our publication, what we say is we don't know enough data to be able to say, well, this is the boundary where it should be, this should be the referendum. So what we've said is, if there were enough people north of the Tropic of Capricorn with the balance of power, we would have a commission of inquiry established to work out whether it's viable, where the boundary should be, and a whole raft of other questions. But of course, the pivotal point in there is winning the balance of power. There are 17 seats north of Rockhampton. The LNP hold just 2 of those seats. The Katter Party holds 3. NQ First, Jason Costigan, has 1 in the seat of the Whitsundays, and in the seat of Morani, One Nation holds the seat. So we head into this election and we say, is there an opportunity there for a group to hold the balance of power? There is. The Katter Party had, with the support of an independent in 2016, had the balance of power and moved a motion. I could speculate about who drafted that motion. Put a motion in the Parliament to say there should be a process towards a new state. Every single member of the Labor Party voted against it, and nobody for the Liberal Party voted for it. There were some people who abstained from it. So what do we know? We know that those 2 major parties are controlled from the southeast. Let me tell you a funny story. If you were a member of the federal parliament, historically, you were called an MP. In the Queensland Parliament, if you were a member of the lower house, you were an MLA. If you're a member of the upper house, you were an MLC, member of the Legislative Council. Peter Beattie comes along and says, no, we're going to call them MPs in Queensland, just like the federal parliament. Well, what kind of MPs have we had in the north? Anna Bligh, the high leftist, despite the richest period in Queensland history, leftist with the highest debt to GSP ratio of any state in Australia. So along comes Gamble Newman, aka Gamble Newman, sorry. And him and his mate Tim Nicol come along and say, no, we need to cut, slash and retrench, flying in the face of the most fundamental economic policy and push the north into recession. Yeah. So the Labor Party, what did they do when Anna Bligh was there? Put your hand up, the people from the north, you've got to vote with the ALPs, bunch of puppets. Along comes Campbell Newman and his sidekicks. No, what did they say? Nothing. Drove us into recession, bunch of muppets. Muppets and puppets. That's what we've got in the ALP and the LNP. And so we head into this election. The voice of the north is where? So MPs, yeah, they are. Let's go. Unless we get the balance of power, we're going to be dealing with spark plug policies for the next 20, 30 years.
And look, you're totally right. You know, my other guests, I've been lucky enough to have some pretty big names so far, and one of them, of course, was John Roscommon, and we really discussed in depth, I would say, the implications for the federation and for the nation as a whole. Like, for me, this is about Queensland and about being a North Queenslander. I want to empower myself. I want to empower my fellow North Queenslanders. It's about, one of the slogans we have is you and me without the 73 seats in the southeast corner. Whatever differences we may have as North Queensland, when it comes to world views, political views and whatnot as North Queenslanders, that's fine. We can sit down and sort them out. We're the people with skin in the game. We're the people who are closest to the issues, and of course the people with the knowledge to fix up the problems. That's how democracy works.
Yeah.
So if we can get this new state, it's not only is it going to empower us, not only is it going to fix all these power imbalances, not only is it going to fix things for the voiceless up here in North Queensland, it's really going to have implications for the rest of the country. I can see places. David Flynn articulates it so well. He goes, well, for those who know David Flint, he's very, very erudite indeed. And he says, well, after you have booted Brisbane, Matthew, I would like to see a movement to mug Melbourne and perhaps sack Sydney. And that is going to bring back competitive federalism, something that I'm particularly passionate about. But look, I just want to duck back really, really quickly. And if I could just get you to quickly explain, what do you think the procedure will actually be? And let's say when. And because I am going to say when, because Bernard Salt's right. It really is a matter of when. Separation is inevitable. It's just a matter of time. It is right that people should be able to control their own destiny. So when we win, when we get enough push to make this happen, how's it going to come about, Peter? Explain the procedure.
On our website, we've got a small handbook that people can download and have a read, and we actually talk about the process in quite a lot of detail in that handbook. It's not the first time that there's been a referendum in Australia for a new state. There've been 2 previous referendums. The first one, it was interesting. You mentioned Professor Flint and saying Melbourne and Sydney, because that first referendum that was held in 1967, very interesting year, in New South Wales for the new state of New England, only went down by about 10 or 15%. But the precursor to that was the Nichols Commission of Inquiry in 1932, and that commission was established by New South Wales. And remind me to come back to New South Wales, because there's a few initiatives happening there at the moment that are of high importance to the rest of the country. So Nichols Commission of Inquiry was appointed to see whether there were new states that were viable in New South Wales. And the recommendation of Commissioner Nichols was one in the Riverina and one in the Northern Rivers up on the northeastern side. It went into abeyance, of course, because of the war. And then in 57 and 67, the referendums were finally held. But the Commission of Inquiry was pivotal because it's an independent body. It gathers the data. It then works out whether things like water, power, communications, sustainability, and says, this is an area that is suitable. And it's like Commissioner Nichols recommended 2 areas in New South Wales, both the Riverina. And so that the process is, if the balance of power was there, then in the Parliament, the initiative would be to establish an independent inquiry, and then everyone could make submissions about whether a new state was, viable, what its benefits would be. And you mentioned before about, the importance of states. Has there been a more important lesson for everyone about the importance of states and how states manage issues than COVID-19? Now, rightly or wrongly, state boundaries are at this point keeping a group that's highly infectious quarantined, keeping a part of the state, Northern Territory and other Western Australia, in their own boundaries, and limiting. If we were able to draw the line at Rockhampton, would it be better for the nation just for COVID-19? In my view, absolutely it would be. So that's helped. We talk about the National Cabinet. There is going to be very much a realignment of the states and the federal government after COVID-19. And I said I wanted to talk about something that's happening in New South Wales right now. And what's happening in New South Wales is that there's been a report commissioned by the New South Wales government to reform tax. One of the problems that we've endured since Federation is, after the failure of the referendum in 1898, Section 7 of the Constitution was amended, and a section called Section 96 was implemented into the Constitution. If there's one section of the Constitution that's causing more than its share of problems today, it's Section 96. The Commonwealth, over the 100 years since Federation, has accumulated the power with almost exclusively with respect to taxation. At the time of federation, the states recovered the money that they spent. During the war, they ceded their power over income tax to the Commonwealth, and so the Commonwealth ended up with a booty of money. And so what does it do? It uses Section 96, which is it can give grants and tied grants to the states. So what has it done? It's politicised Section 96. So the Commonwealth now has this bundle of money, and basically they call it cooperative federalism. It's not, it's coercive federalism. And you say, well, the Commonwealth's there, but the new challenge is coming. And that new challenge is by 2040 is forecast that in the New South Wales report just recently released 2 or 3 weeks ago, by 2040, there'll be no petrol-driven cars sold. 40% of excise on our fuel is tax, right? That 40% excise is a tax. There is a shortfall of money. So where's the taxation going to come from for the states to provide things like health services, roads, education? Where is this money coming from? And these are issues that we need to confront. The deal that's been put in the report is that we need to move to the Commonwealth recovering the income tax, but a proportion of that income tax going back to the state where it's earned. For Queensland, that means, no, we don't want the income tax that's earned in North Queensland to go to Brisbane, because we don't have a check and balance in Brisbane. This is a very important issue for North Queensland. If we are going to move in changes in taxation in the next 10 to 15 years, then we need a check and balance on what's going on in George Street.
Look, exactly right. And we've got what I describe, constantly as a critical mass of electorates in the southeast corner, which really has resulted in the distortion of democracy. I've just had a comment come up that I think is particularly relevant. One of our listeners has indicated that the small nation states in Europe, one of the reasons that they probably evolved this way was almost no doubt as a result of constant dealing with this kind of epidemic, and the fact that in dealing with epidemics, quarantine was really the only kind of way to do it. And it's really funny that previously, and look, I just want to say this by saying, Boot Brisbane, like your organisation, is not specifically party political. We don't deal. We have no official links with any party. All we are concerned about is any individual, any candidate, or any party that's interested in the issue. If they do, we will support them, and if they don't, we obviously don't support them, and we'll work to bring about their support. But it's funny how how one side of politics was really about knocking down borders, both national, within the state, and everything else, and all of a sudden that particular side of politics is now very, very keen on borders indeed. So it's just it's funny how quickly things could flip. Like if you had said to me pre-COVID that there would have been any Labor government anywhere that was all of a sudden keen on borders, be they national or state, I'd have laughed at you. And now look. So look, I do believe that this trauma, I suppose, is providing us with a degree with a degree of opportunity. And this is something I wouldn't mind discussing. But before we get on to that, you have mentioned your organisation a few times. Could you tell me and our listeners a little bit about the North Queensland State Alliance, who you are, how you came about, and what you're aiming for?
Yeah, I guess it goes back to 2000, or I guess the real impetus, I came back from Brisbane, the Commission of Inquiry, and set up my own work and whatever, and then heavily involved in sport. And a number of times being at cricket championships and watching the disappointment on our kids' face in Brisbane at championships when they've outperformed Southern kids and not getting picked was a real motivator. And then with a few like-minded people said, well, we know a bit about what went on in the history. Do you want to have a bat and see whether we can bring about some change? And that's basically the way it came about. It wasn't. I said, yeah, sure. What we will do is we'll look to inform the debate. We know that the merits are there. And so we incorporated in 2017. Today we're sitting at about 150 people in the membership, with people, north, south of Townsville and United Kingdom and New South Wales who are expats from North Queensland, and all passionate about the North and its identity and us as a people and our identity. So our purpose is to enliven debate, and certainly, as I've tried to say a few things tonight, and say there's a lot of debate that's been uninformed. So we can inform that debate and say that as a community, as a democracy, we can have that debate and say, let the people choose. You know, the words of Tony Fitzgerald, which I quoted once, you know, that you don't have an upper house, then in the words of Anastasia Palaszczuk, we don't have two states. You know, we don't support a new state. Okay, whatever happened to the people's choice? And that's what we're about, is saying we'll inform the debate. If we have the Commission of Inquiry, let the independent umpire say yes or no. The difficulty for North Queensland is no senators, which is Section 7, and of course no upper house. If we don't fix those two things, then my friend driving his life vehicle, the road is going to stay pretty bumpy.
Yeah, the Model T Ford, which was great for its time, but not so good anymore. Look, after the Commission of Inquiry, what would happen then?
Oh, well, it depends what the recommendations of the Commission were. Of course, the Commission come back and said no, it's not recommended. Well, I guess then all of us would be able to say, well, the independent umpire, and I guess that would be something about establishing the Commission and who that person or persons were on that panel. Certainly, I've got a few people, and Tony Fitzgerald is one of them that I would like to see, you know, thought about as heading that inquiry, and saying, well, okay, and if the prospect is that there an area in North Queensland is suitable for a new state, then we would move to a referendum. Mm-hmm. And if the referendum was successful, then it would be a matter for the Queensland Parliament to pass an act, and then for the Commonwealth under Section 121 to help establish the new state.
Now, for the referenda, who would that involve?
Well, the model that we have is, as I said, you know, people looked at New South. Oh, it's the whole of Australia. Well, the New South Wales example is it's only the people in the area that being set aside as a possible new state would vote. Yeah.
Okay. So correct me if I'm wrong. What I've got in my head is this. So first we get a Commission of Inquiry. The Commission of Inquiry pretty much gives structure to the debate and the discussion. It indicates where a boundary could or should be. It kind of makes a decision as to in regards to the viability, and chaps like you and me know that it's viable. Chaps like Bernard Salt have indicated that it's viable, and of course, the very fact that we're having this conversation indicates that it's politically desirable, which is in my mind the greatest push. So they would, and let's say they draw the line at, just say, this is for the purposes of discussion, just a little bit south of Gladstone.
Yeah.
Like to have a power station. Then the people north of that line would have just an internal referendum there as to whether or not it's desirable. The results of that referendum will be passed on to the Parliament of Queensland, of the old state, so to speak, and it would be validated or invalidated there. Is that correct?
Well, if it's passed as legislation, then that's 124 the Constitution complied with. Right. And then it goes back to the Commonwealth to say it needs to be established, you know, under 121. Okay,
so that's rather like the old colonial precedent that colonies could kind of ask, but it had to be validated by what?
Yeah. It's in 124. Section 124 says the state of the Parliament may separate a state.
Okay, excellent. Well, really, that's not as complicated as one would think, and it certainly makes things a lot more doable. Look, you know, the only we have raised this issue of real lack of representation, and fundamentally, that's what the issue comes down to. Now, I'd like you to comment on this. Maybe there is another way, but I can't see anything else. There's either one of three ways to fix this. Either A, gerrymander, and I'm not saying that what the Bjelke-Petersen government did in distorting government and having a gerrymander was right. But now that I'm kind of living in North Queensland, I see why it happened. Again, for complete clarity, I'm not defending that. It was wrong. Any distortion of democracy is wrong or bad. But I think that they kind of recognise the dynamic that we're talking about now. So if we're going to fix this, you can either A, have a gerrymander, B, just suck it up and tolerate the rule of our betters down in Brisbane who seem to know much more than us and even minor things. And I really want to come back to the sport issue as well. Even kind of deny us the opportunity to put our kids in sporting groups. or form a new state. Like, am I missing something here? Is there another way that we could kind of fix things legally without completely and utterly throwing away the Constitution?
It's a funny thing, democracy, because there's various models around the world. And you talked about moving to a gerrymander. So Bjelke-Petersen's days, having worked for the Commission of Inquiry, the majority of the things that got distorted during Joe Bjelke-Petersen's day wasn't actually a gerrymander. Gerrymander, the term comes out of the United States, and the way boundaries were drawn around demographic groups to skew voting. What was more apparent in Queensland was what's called malapportionment. So that some seats were as high as 32,000 and some were as low as 18 or 16,000. So you have different numbers in the seats. That's called malapportionment, apportionment of voters. And where you draw boundaries around bits and pieces, that's called gerrymandering. Well, in Townsville, we've got one of those right now, where Palm Island's off to the north, yet it's in the seat of Townsville, but the people who live on the northern side of Townsville have to vote in Hinchinbrook. So we've already got a gerrymander in the state as it is. Let me go back to the single house bicameral legislature, the unicameral or bicameral legislature issue. The words of Tony Fitzgerald here are important. With the single house of parliament, no Bill of Rights, they can do what they want. The reason that they can do what they want is because they end up with an absolute majority on the floor of the parliament. And you get that on the floor of the parliament because of preferential voting. When we look to countries across the world that have single house parliaments that work, and Scotland, before they established their parliament, went and researched it, and the report's available for anyone who wants to read it. And they looked at the various parliaments around the world that were unicameral and said, what makes them work? The thing that makes them work is proportional representation. That means that no party dominates the chamber. And so question time and accountability goes up. The Scottish looked at all the models, including Denmark, Norway, the Scandinavian countries, looked at New Zealand and said, that model's got a lot of benefits. And so they've gone with the New Zealand model, which is proportional representation as well. And of course, New Zealand has another part to its parliamentary system, and that is it also has guaranteed representation rights for Indigenous people, the Maoris of New Zealand. So moving forward, I would hope that if there is a balance of power in the new parliament, that it will actually move to some revamped voting system so that we don't do this again. Because it's repeated itself. I said from 1922, the Labor Party remained almost in office exclusively to 1957 because they could manipulate the boundaries. The change of government came in 57 when the ALP and DLP split, and there they were through to 89. And I just explained there's a gerrymander in Townsville again. So we need to check that system.
All right. Well, that's another magnificent conversation in itself that, God willing, we will have time. We will have time to kind of discuss. Look, I'd really like to, and I suspect that you and I are going to have some respectful disagreement on this, but I'd really like to say what you think it could mean for our for Indigenous people here in North Queensland.
You mentioned at the start that I've worked in some remote communities. I've lived in Flowen Plains in communities. I've been there as a mediator trying to work with communities. I've been an advisor to communities here in Townsville. One of the things that struck me, in one of the northern communities is that despite the closing the gap policy and processes, we've moved that button about 1 point from 1 year. If change is to come, it has to come from within. In any organisation, you can try and impose it and there'll be resistance, but the change has to come within. And there's a lot of talk in our nation about the Indigenous people having a voice to Parliament. The Parliament is the people's house. That's its history. And if you're going to have a voice in Parliament. So that's where I come from. And I go, well, if we're going to have the real voice of change, then be the responsible person and be in Parliament and be part of the debate, not outside, putting arguments to the Parliament.
Oh, look, I was suspecting we were going to disagree, but it turns out that we don't. That is one thing that has, I must say, I have found particularly kind of heartwarming. Look, really, you look at Indigenous representation in Parliament. Of course, there's been the magnificent Senator Neville Bonner, a man I wish I could have met. We had Mr. Derail, who was I believe, I may be corrected on this, but off the top of my head, I believe he was the first Indigenous person who was in state Parliament here in Queensland.
State Parliament, yes.
Yep. Yeah. Again, fully elected, and we're getting
Eric Derail.
Yeah, Eric Derail. Yeah, I never got to meet him, unfortunately. But I am acquainted with a number of his family members, and some of the stories they tell about him as a magnificent man. Again, would have been a really, really interesting person to meet. But what I really love the idea that Indigenous people now don't see democracy as the enemy, don't think that they need well, clearly some do, but you know, some people do think that we need like the Maori representation kind of model. I don't think that that's healthy. I think dividing any representation along the lines of race is fraught with danger, even if it's particularly well-intentioned. And I find it reassuring that we're getting relatively high amounts of people just elected because they're good representatives, not because of any other reason other than they are the people that that group of people in the area want representing them. So I'm very, very, very personally, I have to say, any distortion of democracy, regardless of how good the intentions are, especially on racial lines, really, I got to say, makes me very, very nervous. And I didn't think that you and I would agree on that, but that's kind of cool. But mate, look, we're coming up to the hour mark. I'm tempted to keep going because we did have that. Look, it was about a 7-minute break. Again, I must apologise. I'm not a big one for doing the big mea culpas on air, but I am terribly sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. I assure you that will not be a course of conduct. In fact, most of our interviews have been gaining in professionalism as we go up, and that's one of the reasons why we're getting increasing views all the time, something I do find reassuring. It won't be a course of conduct, but I feel that we really should wrap this up on that note. I think we've covered off on pretty much everything I wanted to discuss with you. The only last, well, we'll do this really, really quickly. In regard to you started discussing sport before. Now, this is an issue that actually comes up because Brisbane has done a number of road shows. Really, we've held meetings in the Atherton Tablelands, Mount Isa, Townsville, Mackay, Rockhampton, Gladstone, as far south as Bundaberg, and we've identified supporters of the new state in all of those areas. And anytime we're speaking publicly and to the media, and when we're getting dial-ins, because there's been a couple of dial-in interviews, sport always comes up. Now, could you speak very, very quickly about Henry, I never pronounce his name correctly, Fracchia?
Fracchia, yeah.
Fracchia. Henry Fracchia has written what I think is a brilliant paper in regards to opportunity in sport and all that sort of stuff. Can you comment that it's actually real, that we really are not getting the opportunities when it comes to things like sport representation because of this bloated political boundary that we have?
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. You know, it's an area, so it's really where I began, you know, about opportunities for kids. I grew up in Innisfail, and I used to go up to Cairns. The United Kingdom side, the rugby league side, would come and it played in Cairns, and I'd go up and watch Marshall Colwell and the Neely Appos of the world, Barry Denmans of the world playing England, you know, Great Britain in Cairns, you know, and the blue and white North Queensland jersey they're playing, and was like, yeah, that's us. In way back in 1994, 93, 94, I grew up playing football against the likes of Gary Boasted. You know, I always say I'm the reason he made it, because I was so bad, made him look so good. That's why he got picked. I mean, the guy's a fantastic footballer, and we grew up in Innisfail together. And so when the initiative came about for the Cowboys, I didn't have any money at the time because I was back studying, but I did find the money and became a foundation member of the Cowboys. And I was there at their first game that they won the first game they played, which was at a club side in Brisbane, I was there for their first win against Illawarra down in Wollongong, because I was studying in Sydney at the time. And so I think winning the premiership in 1995 was, well, it took us, what, from 1908 right through to then to get our chance, and when we got it, we took it. Cricketers, Mitchell Johnson, Andrew Simons, there's other, and we can go through all the sports and say, gee, if only our kids got a better chance. Netball, the 2 franchises went into Brisbane. Why didn't one of those franchises come into the North? Would our girls have loved the opportunity to be in the league? Of course they would have. My disappointment was standing at a championship in 2015 and watch our young fast bowler get bowler of the week, aggregate of the week, average of the week, and then not get picked. And watch the disappointment on his face and go, what are we doing here? What are we actually doing here? And sort of the sport angle takes us, to finish off on tonight. 2 points I want to finish off if I can. More government. Why would there be more government? Well, the senators is the only thing we're after. We create the new parliament. We've got 17 people in the parliament now. They just sit in the new parliament. And the last point, of course, is as we walk the streets of Hinchinbrook in the last election, pushing our North Queensland state campaign, one of the common questions we got, what will happen to state of origin? Well, for the first 20 years, nothing, because you play for the state where you played your first football, so it'll still be Queensland and New South Wales. Then, of course, the kids that are 20 by then are starting to emerge, and they played their first football, their first grade football in North Queensland. So North Queensland will get its own new state of origin team. And my sense is that we'll flog New South Wales and Queensland. So there you go. That's my thought on that.
I found that the sport, the fact that sport is such a touchstone issue, and it is something that really does galvanise people, and it leads and it lets people understand as to the fact that the lack of opportunity we have not to be able to develop our children's talent, and not to be able to showcase them on the national stage. That's real, and I found it kind of for me, because I'm not. It's not that I don't like sport, but I'm a little bit more logical, and I'm just not into sport that much. But I found it a touchstone issue when we were doing our speaking events all up and down the coast. And I found this identity issue was such a big deal. So the last thing I want to wrap up on, we live differently up here. Tell me what that means to you.
Yeah, it was a phrase that Henry Fracker and I were out in Charterstown and we're driving back, and he says, the fact is we live differently up here. I thought, gee, Henry, that's a hell of a line. We do live differently. We have a different culture. We say a bit. Again, a funny story. I was visiting Sydney. I got a call from Mitchell, the guy that he runs 3AW in Melbourne, and he said, "Oh, you're a new stater," and I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I want to do an interview with you. Clive Palmer's office gave us your number to talk about a new state." And I said, "Oh, yeah, ring me back." So he rings me back about half an hour later. I was just getting off the bus. And he says, "We're live to air." And he says, "Well, what do you say to the fact that you're a bunch of rednecks up there?" I was like, "Really? And you're a bunch of Mexicans that live south of the border?" So we can get into name calling all you want, mate. But at the end of the day, we live differently. You want daylight saving in the southeast corner? Go for it. Yeah, our daylight hours are different. We deal with tropical diseases. I gave you the example of Dr. Cotter. As the climate changes, the tropical diseases will happen, and we need our research bases here in the north to research those diseases, to know how the treatment's going to go. How do we adapt and adjust? Climate change is a lot about water, how we manage water. So we live differently. If we go to it, we draw a line across the Tropic of Capricorn. Yeah. There's 76 senators. There's about 6, I think, above that line. 5% of Australia's major dams are above that line, and yet we get over 40% of the nation's water. So we live differently up here. We will manage water differently. We will manage our energy differently. Yeah. So
exactly right. Why do the sensibilities of an inner city Brisbane voter, why are they projected onto us? Because really fundamentally it's about disempowerment. Like why can't our station owners decide whether or not they'll cut down a tree, and if so, how? Why can't we build dams to secure our water security? Why can't we make these simple decisions as to what parts of the environment we're going to preserve and what parts of our country we're going to develop for ourselves? Look, thank you very much. I am sorry about the little bit of lack of professionalism in regards to that fallout there, and I am still getting used to the technology. I'm somewhat of a Luddite, but I do hope our viewers can forgive that. I assure you it will not be a course of conduct. We're going to get better. I'm going to get a little bit better at using the technology. I've got some the coming interviews. If you thought this one was good, and it was very, very good, the other ones are going to be at least as interesting as this man that I've had with me. So look, thank you very much. I also encourage our listeners to like and share. We need to continue to develop the numbers. Also, jump onto the Boot Brisbane website. Please like and share that. We're developing, we have developed a YouTube channel, so please like and share that. If we can actually hit a certain amount of views, we're going to start getting money from that. And of course, the North Queensland State Alliance, Inc. They're a fantastic little organisation as well. They've got some excellent resources, some really, really well-written papers, a lot of stuff that I've written there. So I encourage any of our viewers to jump on there and have a listen. I'd also like to make the really quick point just before I sign right off completely that, yes, there are a number of organisations playing, I suppose you could use the word, in this new state space, but we're all speaking together. It's not the Judean People's Front, the People's Front of Judea. We're working in different spaces with slightly different strategies going towards the same aim. So the fact that we can clearly demonstrate that we are speaking to each other, we are working together for the same aim, does indicate a high degree of unity. So just because there's different organisations, don't think that we're not all together, and don't think that we aren't pushing for the same aim. Thank you very much, Peter. And on that, unless you have anything that you wish to add, we'll sign it off.
No, I hope all our fellow North Queenslanders stay very safe in this very trying time, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.